Most first-time authors spend a lot of time worrying about the drafting. Really, all they want to do is get the words on the page and get finished with that manuscript. It's totally understandable. Who doesn't love a finished draft? But at the same time, your draft is only the first step. After you're done with that big, beautiful draft, you have got to go back and revise it. And this is one of the most challenging parts of the writing process, even for seasoned authors. So today I want to talk about the first step that you need to take, taking your draft from a first draft into a revised, publishable manuscript. Stay tuned. If you are fed up with trying to stumble through this writing project with no idea where you're going or when you'll get there, you need a plan. And I have got the tool for you. Right now, you can download the Writing Plan Calculator. It's going to give you a timeline for your whole book project, the goals that you need to hit along the way, and the flexibility to adjust when your schedule changes. You can download it right now at pageandpodium.com/plan. So once you finish that draft, and even when you're not quite finished with the draft, but you can see the end in sight, I am sure that you know you need to revise. In fact, I hear the fear of revision on so many authors' voices when we're talking about wrapping up that first draft. So I know that it hangs in the back of your mind, kind of taunting you, particularly because oftentimes this is a brand new skill. Many people have never really revised anything. And here's what I mean by that. Oftentimes, when we are in school, when we are kind of going through learning to write, and really even in our professional lives, writing emails, writing blog posts, that kind of thing, oftentimes we confuse the idea of revising with the idea of editing. Now, they're really different. So I want to really quick start by kind of giving you a distinction between those two terms, because we are not talking about editing here. And when you're finished with your first draft, you are not ready to edit yet anyway. Okay? So when we say revising, we are talking about looking at that whole manuscript as one whole draft and thinking about how to shore up the structure. Do we need to move things around? Thinking about whether it fulfills all of our goals. Do we need to add more messaging? Do we need to add more stories? And thinking about the overall flow and cohesiveness of that draft. We are looking to make sure that as a whole, that manuscript is doing what we want it to do. That is the process of revision. It's pretty hard. I won't sugarcoat it. Revision is pretty challenging. The other side, the thing that I think many people hear when I say revising, is the idea of editing. Now, editing is much, much easier. It's much, much more approachable. Many people actually really enjoy doing the editing. But editing is a very different process. So whereas with revising, we were looking at the manuscript as one whole thing, when we talk about editing, we're going line by line, right? We are usually reading just kind of as we go. Now, you should read the whole thing before you start editing. But many people, many times, we're just going line by line. We're cleaning up grammar and punctuation and typos. We're catching, if a word doesn't exactly make sense, maybe we'll trade out a different word for it. We are looking at a very micro level when you think about the grand scheme of your book. It is easy to see why many people will choose to edit over revise. Editing is kind of just a step by step, right? You open it up, you start reading, you start making little changes to the syntax and the dialogue, whatever, the line level stuff. And then you can put it away. You can come back to it the next day. It's very, very easy. On the other hand, when we talk about revising, we are looking at a different skill in your brain. As you have been drafting, you have already been at a line level. Many people in their first draft never really even think about the whole project. It's hard to do that. It's really difficult to kind of wrap your head around a whole entire book. But this is a problem because if you want that memoir or nonfiction or fiction to be readable and enjoyable and publishable, you have to make sure that all those high level things I mentioned in the revising are all present in your book. You have to make sure it's achieving your goals. You have to make sure it's cohesive. You have to make sure that the structure is moving your reader through in a satisfying, fulfilling way. And this is easier said than done. So I want to start here by talking about why revising is so important. I want to talk about what it is that kind of derails authors who know that they should be revising but just don't really know where to start, end up kind of doing all kinds of different things, editing, etc. instead. And then I want to give you a solution that is much, much simpler than you probably are thinking revising has to be. I'm going to give you a first step that is concrete, that is doable, that you can start today, and that you can work on little by little without feeling so overwhelmed by having to know all the answers up front. But let's start with why it is such a problem to think that you can skip revisions. And the reason is, however long it took you to write that book, you learn something new every single day. So let's say the average person is probably going to take 5 or 6 months to write that first draft. Think about who you were 5 or 6 months ago. Now, this is going to vary depending kind of on where you are in your life, but I will tell you, when I think of where I was 5 or 6 months ago, I'm in a really, really different place. Like, I see the world differently. I literally live in a different place, for one thing. But also, the experiences that I have had over that amount of time have changed the way I've looked at things. And not only that, as you wrote your book, you learned about writing. You learned about storytelling. You learned about incorporating dialogue. You learned about giving smooth flashbacks. You were learning all along the way. So I typically suggest, and when I do one-on-one coaching, when I work with the Memoir Method group, I typically do suggest that people move from the beginning of their book through the end. So write chapter 1, then 2, then 3. I know some people will kind of jump around. That's fine. I typically find if you are a first-time writer, and particularly for a memoir or anything that has kind of a progression, I just typically find it's much easier if you can start at the beginning. Then you kind of know what has happened so far. You can kind of build it out. That often means, though, that chapters 1, 2, and 3, etc. are considerably weaker than chapters 18, 19, and 20. You have learned so much over usually 4 months between chapter 3 and chapter 18. You have learned so much. And what that often results in is a very inconsistent manuscript. As your reader, whether that's an agent or a publisher, as your reader moves through that book, they are going to notice that your style has changed, that the way that you're communicating your core message has changed, that even some of your insights have changed. Because frankly, with any kind of nonfiction, you're not only learning about the writing process, you're learning about the topic of it. If it's you, you're learning about yourself. If it's some other nonfiction topic, you're probably researching, reading. You are learning. So when we skip revisions, we really rob ourselves of taking all that knowledge we had in those later chapters and making sure they're really, really clear when the reader cracks open that spine and reads the first page. All of us want our books to be cohesive, right? So when we skip revision, when we go straight to editing, we're missing out on an amazing opportunity to pull this knowledge all the way through and make that book really cohesive. Now, easier said than done. I suspect I don't have to convince you that revising is important. It's more an issue of figuring out how to even do the thing. Not only have you been learning from chapter 1 through chapter 20, you also have likely forgotten a lot of the things that you were thinking about when you were writing chapters 1, 2, and 3, right? I will say I sometimes have, been drafting a book and I'd spend 6, 9 months a year and I come back to it and I think, oh my gosh, what does that even mean? What was I trying to say in that paragraph? No one knows. It's a mystery. And that means that when you are trying to go back and figure out what's even going on, it just gets more and more overwhelming. We cannot hold a whole book in our head. No one can, right? Even if you think about the last book that you read just for pleasure, can you tell us everything that happens? Can you tell us the structure? Can you tell us all of the characters and their backstories and everything they said and everywhere they went? No, we can't, right? Our brains aren't really wired to work that way. So even if we have kind of a structure in mind, which I hope you do before you start writing, even if we know the story very well, it's our own story, we lived it, it is just impossible to hold an entire book manuscript in your head and know what you need to do to make it cohesive. It is not possible. Even very, very seasoned authors cannot do this off the top of their head. So what does that lead us to? Well, we start to put things off, right? We don't know where to start. We don't know what the steps are even going to be along the way. We just don't really know how to do it. And then often what I see, this is the worst, what I will see is that people then put the manuscript in a proverbial drawer and don't look at it for years. I cannot tell you the number of people that I've had come to me with a full manuscript that they wrote a decade ago. They didn't know how to revise it. Sometimes they try to go ahead and just query it to agents and publishers without revising. That is never going to go well. In fact, it doesn't. And finally they decide like, oh my gosh, I got to do something with that manuscript. But it hurts my heart because you could have had the manuscript done 10 years ago if you knew where to start. So with that, let's hop in because I want to talk about this tool that you can use, that you should use as you are moving out of that first draft stage and into your revision stage. And that tool is called a reverse outline. So I want to just tell you up front, this is going to sound so simple that it can't be valuable, but I promise you, you will have so many eye-opening experiences as you are doing this exercise. You will know so much better what you need to do just by finishing this exercise without even getting help from an editor or any other kind of professional. So all a reverse outline is exactly what it sounds like. When you started your book, you hopefully sat down and made an outline of all the things that you wanted to say. You organized it into your structure. You divided it by chapter so that you knew what went into each of the sections of your book. You made a whole plan, right? And with that outline, I bet that you, for the first time, were able to look at that book from a bird's eye view. You were able to say, oh, yes, I see how this can fit together. I see how this can be enjoyable for the reader. I see how the themes are going to weave through, etc. With a reverse outline, you've already written the book, but you're going to do the same thing over again. You are going to go back to that bird's eye view. After you have been so in the weeds of the words and sentences and paragraphs, you're going to go back to what is your structure. All we're going to do is we're going to go through the book and we are going to write down in our outline what is actually there. It's not going to match what you had in your first outline, right? It's going to be a little bit different. You're going to know much more specifically what's in there. And you're going to then be able to compare to your original outline, to your original idea, to make sure everything is the way that you want it before you commit to publishing it. It's magic. So how do we go about reverse outlining our book? You will have heard me say that I am a really big fan of paper and pencil, and I would highly recommend thinking about a paper and pencil to jot down notes. You do not have to do that. You can certainly do your reverse outline in Microsoft Word, but I like to print my manuscript because, let's face it, we haven't usually seen it printed. We've usually seen it on the screen. It feels and looks really different printed. I like to print my manuscript or have it printed at a FedEx or whatever. And then put that manuscript next to you, to your left. put your notebook or whatever you're writing on to the right. All you are going to do is you're going to write chapter 1, number 1, and you're going to look at that manuscript and see what is the beginning. Now, how in depth do we want to go here? We're not going sentence by sentence. We're really probably not going paragraph by paragraph for a whole book, but you will usually know this. So how far in that first chapter do you go on the first idea or the first story? That's what we're looking for. And then what is that idea or story? Write that in your outline. Bonus points if you can remember to put page numbers here and there, because you'll be able to then find back what you were talking about. But at the bare minimum, write down next to that number 1, what was the story or what was the idea? Then you're just going to go back to the manuscript. You're going to keep reading. What's the next story or idea? Number 2, put that in there. Is this tedious? Yes. It's very, very tedious. It is no one's favorite step. But is it effective? Absolutely. So I want to tell you about a client that I had do this recently. So we were in coaching, the coaching phase of her process, and she had finished her draft, and I had read through and given her a manuscript review as part of the package that she had purchased. And she had done some changes. But really what I was seeing was that a lot of the changes were edits versus revisions. So where there were things that I'd pointed out that were really specific, she had done a really good job of making those changes. Where we were talking about structure, where we were talking about kind of the fluidity of the narrative arc, where we were talking about whether the theme and the core message were woven in, she really didn't get those changes made. And she just told me, I can't think of the whole manuscript as a whole. I don't know where stuff goes. I don't know where it is. I assigned her this reverse outline activity, and she did it, and she emailed me. She did it in a Word document. She emailed me the Word document, and she said, well, this was really eye-opening. And for her particular manuscript, the main problem was that the beginning of her book was all stories, but the end of her book was all advice. And you know, I love a hybrid memoir. That's what we work on, but that is not a hybrid memoir. That is 2 different books. And what she needed to do was bring it together, make it more cohesive. Well, as she was doing this reverse outline, it forced her to see how much heavier her top of her outline was in terms of stories, and how much heavier the back of her outline was in terms of facts and ideas and that sort of thing. She knew right away what she needed to do. We needed to move some of the stories, make them into flashbacks later in the story. We needed to add stories in the back end, and then we needed to take some of the advice, move it to the front end, and then we needed to add some kind of more thematic stuff throughout. That is so much easier to wrap your head around when you have got, it'll be probably a 6-page outline. I don't want to sugarcoat. But when you have got that 6-page outline, that's so much easier to see what you're working with than a 200-page manuscript. It just is. You can look and see, well, where was I doing similar things here in the stories that I'm doing in the advice here? Well, let's blend those together, right? Let's take some of these stories and put them here, some of these messages, put it here. And since you printed that manuscript, I know you did, I told you to, you can also start to physically move pieces around and see how things work. You've got your Word doc, so it's no harm if things get all mixed up. But that is going to allow you to kind of mix around and see where things could work better, where things could serve you. And as you're doing this reverse outline, people very often will also find places that they need to cut. So oftentimes you'll see like, oh, I had that story in chapter 3 and chapter 10. Oop, think it works better in chapter 3. Let's cut it out of chapter 10. Or, oh, I keep saying that same idea over and over again. I've got to cut this a few times, or at least figure out a different way to say it. You are going to find all kinds of things that need to be revised. I don't want you to get overwhelmed by this. So all you're going to do at this stage, you're going to make your reverse outline, and then you're going to make notes of what you want to change. We're not going to go in there and start changing things now, right? You can play and mix around and see how your manuscript might fit together differently, but we're not doing anything in the Word doc. You gotta sleep on your reverse outline before you start messing around in your manuscript because I don't want you to make it worse. But that reverse outline will give you some clarity of how you need to move forward, how much work you have to do, and how much support you're going to need. That client I just mentioned, she actually asked us and had us just move some of the things around because she thought, I can't do this, I'm going to mess everything up. So sometimes you might need to hire an editor or kind of a coach slash ghostwriter. An editor in your pocket is the program that we offer, right? You might need to hire someone to just help you do some of that structural stuff, help you kind of at least figure out how you can do it. Make a list. What all do you want to change? And then you can look at it and see what you need help with. Okay, so as you're going through this reverse outline, take your time. You're probably not going to want to do it in all one day. It's going to be a lot. It's going to be pretty tedious, like I said. Give yourself time, give yourself grace. But I know that doing this step is going to show you what you have. And yes, there are things that need to be revised in there. That's true for everybody. But you have also done an amazing thing of getting this draft done. Amazing. I cannot tell you how many people I talk to that is their dream. So try as you're doing this exercise to keep in mind that you've already done something really amazing. You've done something really hard that I'm sure you didn't know how to do before. You don't know how to revise, but you're going to figure that out too. So get in there, figure out what you've got to work with, hold tight to your dream and your goal of having this be an amazing book, and don't give up just because this step is a little bit difficult. Let me know how you are feeling about it, how your reverse outline goes, what kind of realizations you have as you go through that big, beautiful manuscript. I really can't wait to hear from you. I'll talk to you soon. Happy writing. If you're writing your first book, I bet you already know you need a plan. But the hardest thing about making a plan for your first book is you don't have the experience to know how to plan. And that is why I put together our newest free download, the Writing Plan Calculator. With this calculator, you are easily going to be able to figure out a realistic timeline, realistic weekly goals, and the flexibility you're going to need for this long-term project. You can download it now at pageandpodium.com/plan, and you are going to knock this book out of the park. I can't wait to read it.